here we are for Chapter 3, Section 3, Energy in an Ecosystem. So we're going to break down some of these energy aspects that we see there. Now, energy flows. We should know the law of conservation of energy. Energy can neither be created nor destroyed, like the first law of thermodynamics. Energy can neither be created nor destroyed. It can only be transformed from one form into another. So this energy comes into the system and then it gets transformed from one form into another, and therefore it flows through it. And we'll talk about this in terms of food chains and food webs. Let's kind of start off first looking at a food chain. So we'll throw it up here. Food chain is a very simple way of looking at it, just how the energy moves from one system into another. So in the picture we have here, energy is coming into the system through the sun, and then at the very first trophic level, the producers begin producing their energy from it in the form of plants. Could be algae, could be some other, but in this case we're on a terrestrial system. It's coming in the form of plants. The plants convert the energy, turn it into glucose, some sugars, etc. Some heat is lost along the way. If those plants are eaten by the caterpillar, then it moves up the chain, or as some of those plants die, then the decomposers take over. So decomposers are on every step of the chain. But from plants to the caterpillar, which is a primary consumer, making it a herbivore, it then gets eaten by something on the third trophic level, a secondary consumer, in this case a carnivore, could be a carnivore or an omnivore. Then the hawk eats the robin, and then we have a tertiary consumer, and in this case kind of a top carnivore, just another carnivore. And once that dies, it goes down. So this shows a direct chain. And it's not that it's incorrect, but in reality, caterpillars are not the only thing eating the plants. Robins are not the only things eating a caterpillar. Hawks are not the only things or the only animal eating the robin, and the hawk is not dependent on the robin. They're eating other organisms. So this is a nice, neat way to look at it, and it is in its simplistic form. Nothing wrong with it. We'll look at food webs kind of next. So a food chain is a nice, neat way to look at this eats this, this gets its energy from this gets its energy from this, etc. A food web is just trying to show this network, the interconnectedness of it all. And still, food webs don't show the whole thing, but they do try and give us a better picture of what's actually happening. Now, we could have aquatic food chain, or we could have a terrestrial food chain. Right here, we're going to look at a aquatic food chain. We'll take a look at a terrestrial one in a bit. So way down at the bottom, we have plankton. Now, in broad terms, we have two types of plankton. Phytoplankton, these are plankton that convert sunlight, so they're our producers. You also have zooplankton, and the zooplankton are like little teeny tiny microscopic animals. The phytoplankton are like teeny tiny photoscopic plants. Zooplankton are the animals. So you have plankton, and it could be that the zooplankton are eating the plankton, and it can be just other animals like krill, very, very small shrimp, etc. And you even then have whales that can eat them. But starts at the very bottom with the phytoplankton, then we get some krill, some zooplankton, and then some various fish. We'll eat some of them. Even some of the birds may eat that. You have the seals or whales that may be eating krill or plankton. Squids are feeding on it, and then you have your larger organisms feeding on them, whether it's leopard seals, killer whales, etc. But you see the different aspects from it. Sperm whale may be eating squid, but they can also be feeding on other things. The squid may be eating the zooplankton, they may be eating the krill, they can be eating some of the smaller other organisms. So we try and see this direct interconnectedness of anything. And we could just look straight up from the bottom, the phytoplankton to the zooplankton to the fish, to the emperor penguin, to the leopard seal, to the killer whale, up to the human. So we could take any aspect of this and look at a chain, or we can try and look at how they all interact together. You should be fairly familiar with food chains, food webs, but make sure we can break them down. Now, let's also look at an energy pyramid, because whenever we have a transfer of energy from one to the other, from one tropic level to the next, we have a loss of energy. And we'll throw the pyramid up here, and it starts off big, smaller, smaller, smallest. In this case, it's more like little blocks stacked on each other instead of a classic pyramid. But just like in a pyramid, if I'm going to build a pyramid, where do I have the most bricks? At the bottom layer or the top layer? Yeah, right, the bottom. I have to have more bricks at the bottom, fewer, and then at the end I have one brick right at the top. So the energy food pyramid shows the same thing. It's energy flow. There is less energy available at the higher levels. So we're kind of looking at this biomass. So down at the very bottom, it shows producers, phytoplankton, because we've been looking at the aquatic system. It could be plants if it was in a terrestrial system. And it says 10,000. Well, in other words, it takes 10,000 phytoplankton to provide enough food for 1,000 zooplankton. There are 10,000 phytoplankton, and the 1,000 zooplankton are eating them. And then we have 100 secondary consumers, small fish, it says perch, eating the zooplankton. And those 100 fish provide the food necessary for 10 tertiary consumers, in this case, like a human. Now we can break it down in a terrestrial one, and it could be 10,000 blades of grass, can feed 1,000 caterpillars, which could feed 100 robins, and 100 robins would only be enough food for, say, 10 hawks. We lose energy at each step of the way. So you got to remember that 90% rule. 90% rule. We lose 90% of the available energy from one tropic level to the next. So let's take a look at this slide up here of a terrestrial food web. And let me ask this question. How would the extinction of the red-tailed hawk from this food web affect the population sizes of the other species? Would any species increase in number? Would any species decrease in number? And who would wind up being relatively unaffected? This is a good example of what a FRQ kind of question would be. You need to provide detail. It's not one simple answer. You can't say, oh, if the hawk was gone, this one thing would happen. Because if another population is going to increase, what's going to happen to what it's eating? So we need a detailed thing. So I want you to think through that and be able to provide an answer. If the red-tailed hawk becomes extinct in this diagram, what would happen to the other organisms? Think through with details and specifics in order to answer this question. Now, in reality, different systems, different ecosystems produce plant matter faster than others. Just a reality. We're going to look at gross primary productivity. We've talked about warm, wet climates tend to produce more plants than a very dry, arid one, or very hot, arid, like a desert versus a rainforest or something. So this gross primary productivity, or GPP, this is the rate at which an ecosystem's producers, the plants, can convert the solar energy into stored chemical energy. They're turning it into the leaves, they're turning it into the fruit, the vegetables, what have you. This is measured in kilocalories per meter squared per year. So when we look at an area's GPP, that's the number we get. We provide a number, that's the number of kilocalories per meter square, per a square meter in a year. Now, we have the gross productivity, GPP, or we have the net primary productivity, the NPP. Now, here's the difference. The gross is everything that's happening from the solar energy converting it into usable energy. The NPP is what winds up being available for everything else. And that's really the crucial point. So the net primary, the rate at which the ecosystem convert the energy into chemical energy minus the rate at which they use the stored energy. It takes energy for them to make their fruit, etc. So the solar energy hits the plant. Well, some of that energy is going to breaking up the carbon dioxide and water molecules and forming the sugar molecule. So we can't use all the energy that they're getting from the sun. The plant is using some of it itself, and that is lost in the form of heat or into the environment. Just as the plant grows and develops, it's not available for you and me. So that's the gross. The net is how much is left minus what they used. Now, terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems differ in their NPP. How much of this productivity is there? And the planet's NPP limits the number of consumers. It's the prime limiting factor. Remember, a limiting factor is anything that keeps something from being able to grow. That one thing that we don't have enough. If there's not enough fertilizer, the plants only grow so big. If there's not enough water, plants can only grow so big. So it's a limiting factor, and that is the primary limiting factor of how many organisms, etc., can be there, number of consumers, including you and me, humans, that can survive on the earth. The higher the NPP, the more organisms can be here. Ultimately, it comes down to how well can the plants take the energy from the sun and turn it into useful food for the consumers. Now, if you're a little bit confused between GPP, the gross primary productivity, and the NPP, net primary productivity, many of you are getting to the point, as many of you already have jobs or getting paychecks, and many of you are getting to the point that you will be pretty soon. And if not, you can touch base with your parents, anybody else making money. It is the difference between my gross pay and my net pay. It's really the same type of thing. So let's say you make $50,000 a year. You sit down at the table and they offer you a job and you kind of haggle and you come out to, they're willing to pay you $50,000 a year. Ah, fantastic. You go home and you start planning out how much money that is. Well, my dad would say, hold your horses there. Let's take a look at things. Well, you're going to be taxed. And at $50,000, you're going to fall into the most basic tax bracket of about 28%. So about 28% of what you earn is going to go into taxes, have to be paid for taxes. So you got to calculate that in. So if I take 50,000 times 0.28, it leaves out $14,000. Right off the top, $14,000 of that gross is going to go to taxes. In other words, your growth and development, it's just gone. Leaving you with $36,000, and that's your net pay. When it really comes down to it, I'm concerned with my net pay because that's my buying power. That's how much I have to be able to budget to rent my apartment, buy my house, buy a car, go to the movies, get food, etc. My gross pay is not as important to me as my net pay. So we're more focused on the net primary productivity than the gross. And in class, we'll practice some calculations of how to find out what something's NPP is, just converting and using the formula. Now, on the slide we have up here, we're going to look at some of these ecosystems do produce plant matter faster than others. So if we look at the terrestrial ones, they're in green at the top. So swamps and marshes, they're our highest producers. Typically swamps and marshes tend to be where it's warm. It's unusual to find them in real cold areas, but tend to be where it's warm and there's a lot of water. So they produce a lot of plant matter. Plant matter, or at least producers, algae as well. In a swamp and a marsh, you got a little bit of both worlds kind of going on. tropical rainforest, almost equal with a swamp and a marsh. Once again, it rains almost every day, warm, produces a lot of plant matter. Temperate forest, deciduous forest. If you're in Florida or the east coast of the United States, by and large, deciduous forest is what you see when you kind of get outside in the woods. Once again, pretty high. Then we go down into coniferous forests, coniferous, cone-bearing pine tree forests, taiga way up north, etc. Savannas, which are a type of grassland. Savannas are found in the tropical areas. Agricultural land, where we're just growing farm, very much that's where we took over grasslands as well. And it moves on down till we get to scrub desert and extreme desert, something like the Sahara Desert. Very little. If we look at the aquatic ecosystems, estuaries are the highest, and estuaries are where fresh water is meeting salt water, so we get a lot of life, kind of a boundary area. Lakes and streams, then the continental shelf, the area where it's also known as the littoral zone in water, the area where light reaches to the bottom. So that's where we can get seaweed and stuff growing on the bottom. Coral reefs would be found in this area. But note the open ocean is actually the least of all the aquatic ecosystems out of the actual open ocean. Now, its net PPP is low, but its overall production of food is very high because it's so big. So swamps and marshes create a lot of NPP, but they don't cover a lot of land or area. Forests actually cover a lot more land, so they wind up producing some of our most NPP. So we have to kind of look at what produces the most, but then how much land or area or water do they actually cover. So the ocean actually has a lot of NPP, even though its actual rate is not that great, simply because there's so much of it. Well, that wraps it up for section 3, looking at some of this, and we will see you next time when we look at matter, how matter cycles in an ecosystem. Take care, we'll see you next time.